Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
I should have known the minute I saw the sign on the front door. Welcome, baby Madison, in glittery pink letters with matching balloons that probably cost more than my monthly internet bill, that this wasn't going to be just another baby shower. It was going to be a performance, and my sister Molly was the star of the show. The crowd, the pastel decorations, the mason jars filled with lemonade and sliced strawberries, the coordinated floral dresses, even the napkins had a theme. That's what Mom does. She curates a moment, packages it for bragging rights. But she doesn't do it for me. Never has. I parked down the street. There wasn't room in the driveway, of course. That was all SUVs with baby on board stickers and oversized bows from the gender reveal party last month. I walked in carrying the gift I wrapped in the car, a baby monitor from Molly's registry and a handwritten card I spent maybe 5 minutes on. I knew no one would notice either. As I stepped through the front door, my mom looked up from the kitchen island, blinked like she forgot I existed, then smiled and waved like she'd been meaning to call for weeks, which she hadn't. "Emily, you made it." "Oh, good, there are extra chairs in the back." And that was it. No hug. No, "How's work?" No, "So proud of you," even though I had just finished coordinating a 3-month engineering simulation that would probably end up in a published white paper. It didn't matter. Nothing I did ever did. Molly, of course, looked glowing. Her bump was perfectly rounded, cradled by a lace maternity dress that looked like it belonged on a bridal magazine cover. She was laughing at something her husband Jake said, tossing her blonde curls and holding a mocktail in one hand. She looked like a fertility goddess, and she knew it. I gave her a polite hug, said congratulations, and slid into the background like I always did. I made my way toward the appetizer table, where a woman I vaguely remembered from Molly's book club was raving about the charcuterie board. Someone else was already playing a slideshow of Molly's baby photos, mixed with her latest ultrasound. Dad was in the corner sipping a light beer and looking like he'd rather be at home watching a rerun of Law and Order. I envied him for that. Then it happened. Right after the second round of games, something about guessing the baby food flavor, Mom stood up and rang her stupid little silver bell that she uses for parties like this. Everyone turned. Cameras lifted. My Aunt Marie pulled out her phone like she was about to film the State of the Union. "I just want to say a few words," my mom began, her voice already trembling with practiced emotion. "Today is such a special day. My baby girl, my sweet Molly, is about to become a mother. And I've waited a long time for this moment. I've been waiting to become a grandmother, and today I finally have a reason to brag." Laughter. Not polite laughter, full-on chuckles from nearly everyone in the room. Jake slapped Molly's knee. A cousin of ours actually clapped. Someone in the back repeated, finally, like it was the punchline of a running joke. Except it wasn't a joke. It was a dagger. I felt my stomach knot up, the way it used to when I'd bring home straight as in Mom would barely look up from the stove. I felt heat crawl at my chest. She didn't look at me. Not once. I wasn't even mentioned. Not my work, not my life, not even my presence in the room. And maybe if I hadn't spent 30 years pretending that didn't bother me, I could have stayed silent. But I didn't. I stood up slowly, not dramatically, just intentionally. People started turning their heads. Molly glanced up and did a double take. The room was still echoing with the aftershock of my mother's brag comment, and I knew I had maybe 10 seconds before someone tried to shift the mood again. So I smiled. Not a real smile, a tight-lipped, this won't take long smile. And I said, clearly enough for every single person to hear, "That's weird." Because this offer letter from NASA just came in my name. I pulled the folded paper from my purse, the actual one I hadn't even told anyone about yet, and held it up. Silence. You could have heard the baby's future heartbeat in that room. Even the Bluetooth speaker stopped playing Taylor Swift. My mom blinked. Her mouth opened slightly, like she wasn't sure if I was joking or being petty. Molly turned red, not angry red, embarrassed red. Jake looked confused, then uncomfortable. My dad sat up straighter. I didn't wait for applause. I didn't want it. I just folded the letter back up, slipped it in my bag, and sat down. No one spoke for a full 5 seconds. Then Aunt Marie let out a single nervous, well then, like she was trying to slap a band-aid on a bullet wound. That's the thing about finally speaking up, it doesn't feel triumphant. Not right away. It feels dangerous. Like you lit a match and you're waiting to see what catches fire. But here's a question for anyone still watching this, and I want you to really think about this, maybe even drop it in the comments. If you'd spent your whole life being treated like the family's footnote and someone finally handed you the mic, would you take your shot, even if it ruined someone else's moment? Because I did. And it did. And I'd be lying if I said I regret it. But that moment? That one single sentence? It wasn't just payback. It was the start of something. And none of them, not Molly, not Mom, not even me, were ready for what came next. By the time the baby shower had officially ended and the last of the gift bags had been distributed with those saccharine little "thank you for coming" tags my mother had spent 3 hours designing, I was already standing near the coat rack, wondering whether I should slip out without saying another word or stick around long enough to confirm just how uncomfortable I'd made everyone. There was a slow, almost painful shift in the atmosphere, the kind that doesn't announce itself with shouts or slammed doors, but with sideways glances, lowered voices, and the kind of overcompensating laughter people use when they're pretending nothing just exploded. No one really knew what to do with me. I had just committed what, in my mother's tightly choreographed world, amounted to a public execution, not with blood or screaming, but with facts, timing, and a tone so casual it cut deeper than anything theatrical ever could. I wasn't sorry, not exactly, but I wasn't proud either. There was something nauseating about finally taking a swing at the people who'd spent their lives making you feel small, because even if you land the punch, you're still the one standing there with your hands shaking. I was reaching for my coat when I heard my sister's voice behind me, a little sharper than usual, a little less polished, like the edges were starting to show. Seriously? You couldn't just let me have today? I turned slowly, expecting maybe a conversation, maybe even a fight, but what I saw was Molly standing there, arms crossed over her chest, her face flushed not with the soft glow of pregnancy or the effort of hosting, but with genuine irritation, the kind of emotion she usually saved for long lines or bad haircuts. She looked like someone who wasn't used to being confronted and had no idea how to process it. "I didn't take anything from you," I said quietly, though every word felt heavier than I intended. "I just corrected the record." She scoffed, that little half-laugh she used to do in high school when she wanted to make sure everyone knew she thought I was ridiculous, but not worth arguing with. "You've always had this thing, Emily. This need to outshine people. You walk around acting like you don't care what anyone thinks, but the second Mom praises me, suddenly you're waving your career around like a trophy." I wanted to respond, I really did. I wanted to tell her that I hadn't said a damn thing for years, not when Mom forgot my birthday that one year because she was too busy helping Molly plan her engagement party, not when she told people I worked with computers, even though I'd just published a research paper on autonomous navigation systems, and definitely not when she sat across from me at Thanksgiving and asked, deadpan, "When are you going to bring home someone we can actually talk to?" As if my last boyfriend's PhD in robotics made him less human than Molly's husband, who sold real estate and thought climate change was a conspiracy. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I said, "Do you really believe that?" She blinked. "What?" "That I did it to outshine you." She hesitated. And that's when I saw it, not just the annoyance or the bruised ego, but the deep, gnawing fear that maybe, just maybe, I had finally done something she couldn't compete with. It wasn't a wedding ring or a gender reveal or a Pinterest-perfect nursery. It was something she couldn't Instagram. And that terrified her. She didn't answer, not directly. Instead, she said, "You always were jealous." And that, of all the things she could have said, was what hit me hardest. Not because it was true, it wasn't, but because it revealed something I hadn't wanted to admit. That even after all these years, Molly still saw me not as her sister, but as her rival. And not even a threatening one, just someone orbiting outside her spotlight, bitter and cold, desperate to steal a little warmth. There was a long pause, the kind that stretches until it's too late to fill it with anything useful, and then she turned and walked away. Not dramatically. Just like it was over. Like the matter was settled. I stood there for a moment, my coat still half on, trying to decide if I should follow her, apologize, explain, clarify, all the things women are trained to do when they've made people uncomfortable, but something stopped me. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe it was the quiet realization that the apology would never be enough, because it wasn't about the baby shower. It never had been. I found my father in the kitchen, exactly where I expected him to be, pretending to organize empty cans into recycling bins even though he hadn't spoken more than 3 sentences all afternoon. I stood beside him for a moment, waiting for him to acknowledge me, say something neutral like, "Nice to see you," or "How's work going?" But he just kept stacking cans like he was building a wall between himself and the entire family. "I didn't mean to make a scene," I said, not really expecting a reply. He finally looked up, just briefly. His eyes didn't look angry or disappointed. They looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from years of silence. "You know how your mother gets," he said quietly. And there it was. Not a defense. Not a rebuke. Just a lifeline tossed into the middle of a shipwreck, too little and too late. I left without saying goodbye. No hugs, no thanks for the party, no fake smiles. I stepped outside into the fading light of early evening, walked back to my car, and sat there with the door open and the wind catching the edge of that letter, the one from NASA, still in my bag, still crisp and untouched. I pulled it out again, read the first few lines for what felt like the 100th time, and for a moment, I felt that flicker of validation. Not pride, exactly, but a kind of quiet affirmation that no one could take away, no matter how many showers they threw or how many toasts they raised. But the truth was, I hadn't accepted the offer yet. I didn't know if I would. And that, more than anything, terrified me, not because I didn't think I could do it, but because I wasn't sure if it would make any difference. Not to them. Maybe not even to me. And as I sat there, listening to the sound of car doors slamming in the distance and laughter still echoing faintly from the house, I realized something that stopped me cold. I hadn't just made a scene. I had cracked something wide open, something that had been festering for decades. And now that it was out in the open, there was no putting it back. But there was still one person I hadn't heard from. And I had a feeling when she finally spoke, I wasn't going to like what she had to say. That night, long after the last slice of cake had been scraped off the plate and the last smile had been faked in the name of family unity, I found myself sitting alone in my apartment, lights dimmed low, shoes still on. As if I hadn't really come home, but had simply paused somewhere between the woman I used to be and the version of myself who had finally dared to speak out loud. The apartment was quiet, save for the distant hum of traffic outside and the rhythmic tick of the wall clock that usually faded into the background, but now felt like a countdown to something inevitable. I had placed the letter, the actual offer from NASA, on the coffee table in front of me, unfolded and staring back at me like a challenge, a mirror and a weapon all at once. I hadn't lied about it. That was the part one kept circling back to, obsessively, as if repeating the truth to myself enough times would dull the sharpness of what I had done. The letter was real. The offer was real. I had spent the last 4 years on a project that no one in my family even asked about, working 70-hour weeks on deep space navigation systems, submitting proposals that got rejected a dozen times before they were finally accepted, flying to conferences on my own dime, and coming back to silence. No congratulations. No curiosity. Just mild confusion when I tried to explain what I did at the dinner table, the kind of half-smile people give when they're politely waiting for you to stop talking. So no, I hadn't lied. But I hadn't told the truth either, not fully, not the part that mattered most. I hadn't accepted the job. In fact, I hadn't even decided if I wanted it. The truth, the kind of truth you don't say out loud because it sounds too pathetic even to whisper to yourself in the dark, was that I was scared. Not of the job, I could do the work, I'd been doing the work, but of what it meant to say yes to something so monumental when no one who mattered to me even cared enough to ask. There's a certain loneliness in succeeding quietly, in being your own witness, in celebrating alone in your apartment because your family still thinks NASA is just a sticker on your laptop and not a door you fought to kick open. And what made it worse, what gnawed at me from the inside out, was the fact that I hadn't planned to announce it. I hadn't gone to that baby shower with some rehearsed monologue tucked in my purse, just waiting for the chance to hijack the spotlight. I hadn't worn anything fancy or practiced a triumphant pose in the mirror. I'd been prepared, as I always was, to fade into the background, to clap politely, to take a group photo I'd never be tagged in, and to leave quietly without being noticed. But then came the toast. That toast. That one sentence. To the daughter who finally gave me a reason to brag. It had hit me like a slap, but colder. Not just because it stung, but because of how expected it was. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't outraged. I was just done. Done swallowing it. Done pretending that I hadn't heard versions of it my whole life, from the time Molly got her first lead in the school play and Mom called the entire neighborhood, to the day I received my scholarship to MIT and she responded by saying, "Don't forget to pack warm clothes, Boston gets cold." So no, I hadn't lied. But I hadn't planned to say it either. It had just come out, one sentence, clean and sharp, dropped like a hammer in the middle of the room. And now, here I was, wondering if that one moment of truth, of raw, unscripted truth, had done more damage than years of silence ever had. My phone buzzed beside me, breaking the stillness like a dropped glass, and I picked it up to see a long message from Molly. Not a reply to anything, not a question, not even an olive branch, just a statement, typed out in several neat paragraphs like she'd written and rewritten it until the tone felt just right. The words blurred a little as I read, not from tears, but from that strange haze that happens when you already know what someone's going to say before they say it. She called me cruel. She said I was calculated. She said she was tired of walking on eggshells around my moods, my resentment, my need to one-up everyone. And then, near the bottom of the message, buried between the passive-aggressive pleasantries and the not-so-subtle digs, was the sentence that stopped me cold. "You always needed to steal attention from me. That's why Mom never liked you." I read it twice. 3 times. And I felt something shift in my chest, not anger, not sadness, but something deeper, older, something I couldn't name. The thing is, I had always suspected it. I had always felt it in the way our mother arranged the seating at holiday dinners, in the way she lit up when Molly walked into a room, in the way she asked me about work with the same tone she'd used to ask a stranger for directions. But seeing it written, seeing that sentiment distilled into words, stripped of any sugarcoating or plausible deniability, made it real in a way I hadn't allowed before. And it raised a question I didn't have the courage to answer. What if Molly wasn't wrong? What if I had been chasing her shadow all these years, not because I envied her life, I didn't, but because I wanted the one thing she always got for free, to be seen, to be celebrated, to be enough. I leaned back into the couch, letting the silence return, and stared at the letter again. There it was, black and white, an invitation to something extraordinary, and yet it felt distant, untouchable, like something meant for another version of me. A version who didn't hesitate. A version who didn't need approval. But I wasn't her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And that's when the thought crept in, slow and uninvited. What if this letter wasn't my triumph, but my last attempt to prove something to people who had already made up their minds? What if I had already lost, not because I wasn't good enough, but because I'd spent too long trying to convince the wrong people that I was? I folded the letter back up, placed it carefully in the envelope, and slid it into the drawer next to my couch, next to old tax papers and utility bills, like it was just another piece of life to be filed away. But even as I did it, I knew something had changed. The lie hadn't been the letter. The lie was thinking that telling the truth would be enough. There are moments in life when silence becomes more dangerous than words, when the things left unsaid start to ferment, turning sour inside you until they affect everything, how you think, how you move, how you breathe around people who are supposed to be family, but feel more like judges in a courtroom where you've already been found guilty. I didn't sleep much that night after the shower, maybe an hour, maybe 2. If you could even call it sleep, because my body never really rested and my mind kept replaying the scene on a loop, dissecting every glance, every twitch of my mother's mouth as I delivered my one-sentence rebellion. I'd expected backlash, sure, but the intensity of it, the text from Molly, the unspoken chill in every family member's face, it settled over me like a fog that just wouldn't lift. It wasn't the drama that wore me down, it was the clarity. For once, everything felt fully exposed. And the hardest part of all was realizing that, even when I told the truth, it didn't matter. Not to them. The next morning, I drove to my parents' house. I didn't call ahead, didn't text, didn't give them the chance to dodge me or prepare their defenses. I needed answers, or at the very least, I needed someone to acknowledge that I wasn't crazy. That what I felt all these years wasn't just some warped perception rooted in insecurity or bitterness or whatever label they wanted to slap on me to avoid taking responsibility. I needed my mother to look me in the eye and tell me why she treated me like I'd never been enough, why every single accomplishment of mine seemed to vanish in the presence of Molly's milestones, why nothing I did, no matter how prestigious, no matter how rare, ever translated into pride in her eyes. I pulled up in front of the house, the same white two-story colonial I grew up in, with the same blue shutters and the same cracked driveway that my dad kept promising to reseal. Everything about it felt frozen in time, like stepping into a photograph that no longer matched the reality of who I had become. I sat in the car for a few moments, staring at the front door, trying to steady my hands on the steering wheel, rehearsing a dozen ways this could go, each one less likely than the last to end in peace. But eventually I got out, walked up the path lined with those gaudy seasonal flags my mom loved. This one had a cartoonish pumpkin and said "Fall into Family" and rang the doorbell. She opened the door wearing a robe, mascara smudged slightly beneath one eye, like she'd slept in her makeup or maybe hadn't slept at all. Her expression flickered for a moment when she saw me, not surprised, but not welcoming either, and for a split second I saw something vulnerable there, something uncertain, before it vanished behind her usual mask of polite distance. "Emily," she said, her voice measured, her tone the same one she used when speaking to neighbors she didn't like but had to tolerate. "I didn't expect to see you this morning." I stepped inside without being invited, brushing past her into the kitchen because standing in the hallway felt too much like asking for permission. The kitchen, of course, was immaculate, just as it always had been, not a dish out of place, not a crumb on the counter. Orderly. Controlled. Like her. I turned to face her as she closed the door and leaned against it like she might bolt at any moment. "I want to know," I said, and my voice cracked, not from weakness, but from the sheer weight of everything behind that sentence, all the years, all the silences. "I want to know why you said what you said yesterday. Why you thought that toast was okay." She didn't answer right away. She moved to the sink, poured herself a glass of water she didn't drink, and stared out the window like she could escape through it if she stared long enough. Finally, she turned around and crossed her arms, and I braced myself, expecting the usual evasions, "I didn't mean it that way," or "You're being too sensitive," but what I got instead was something colder, sharper. "Because it was true," she said flatly. I finally had something to be proud of in front of people who mattered. Molly's giving me a grandchild. That means something. People understand that. They don't know what to do with your space stuff. I blinked, stunned into silence, not because I hadn't heard versions of that sentiment before, but because she'd never said it so plainly, so casually, like she was commenting on the weather. It wasn't said with cruelty, which might have been easier to handle, but with a kind of weary honesty, as if she'd been carrying that opinion for so long it had stopped feeling cruel and just became fact. "And you," she continued, now walking slowly around the kitchen island, her voice gathering momentum, "you've always been difficult. So serious. So intense. Everything with you has always been a debate, a lecture. You make people feel stupid. Do you even hear yourself when you talk? You think that makes people want to be around you." I stood there, absorbing it, my arms frozen at my sides, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum with no rhythm. And still, I said nothing. Not yet. Because she wasn't done. "Molly's not like that," she said, almost wistfully. "She's warm. She's easy. She doesn't make people feel like they're constantly being tested." It was in that moment, right there, with the morning sun slanting through the kitchen window and reflecting off the spotless countertops, that I realized my mother didn't just prefer Molly. She resented me. Not for failing, but for succeeding in a way she couldn't understand, couldn't control, and couldn't relate to. I reminded her of everything she never became, of a world she had no access to, of conversations that moved too fast, that used words she didn't know, that made her feel small. And instead of bridging the gap, instead of leaning in with curiosity or pride, she chose rejection. She chose Molly because Molly felt safe. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tear into her with all the fury I'd been bottling up since I was 10 years old. But instead, I laughed. Just once. A sharp, bitter exhale that startled even me. "You think people don't want to be around me?" I said, my voice low and shaking, not with fear but with restraint. "Maybe it's because I stopped pretending to be someone you could brag about at church." She narrowed her eyes, and for the first time in my adult life, I saw her mask slip, just for a second. Her jaw tightened. Her shoulders dropped. And then she said something I will never forget. "You've always needed to prove something. Even now. Standing here. You think this is some victory? That what? You're the smarter one. The better one? Let me tell you something, Emily. At the end of the day, people don't remember who published what or who got a job at some government agency. They remember who showed up, who had kids, who made a home. That's what matters." And that was it. That was the whole truth, wrapped in smug righteousness and tied with a bow of generational judgment. She didn't just see my life as unfamiliar. She saw it as irrelevant. I walked to the door, my pulse thudding in my ears, and reached for the handle. But before I could leave, my father stepped into the hallway. He hadn't said a word this entire time, not a single sentence, not even a greeting. But now, without looking directly at me, he held out a small envelope, yellowed and thin, like it had been handled too many times and never opened. I took it without speaking, without making eye contact, and he stepped aside to let me pass. And as I left that house, letter in hand, something inside me cracked. Not in a way that broke me, but in a way that finally made room for something new. Whatever was in that envelope, I knew it mattered. Because my father wasn't the kind of man to speak through words. He spoke through what he handed over in silence. It took me several hours to open the envelope, not because I was afraid of what was inside, but because I already sensed, in that wordless exchange between my father and me, that whatever had been sealed away in that thin yellow paper for God knows how long had been kept from me for a reason, and once I saw it, once I allowed those words into my life, there would be no way to unknow them. I had taken it home, left it on my desk untouched, circled it all afternoon like it was radioactive, and tried to distract myself with mundane things: laundry, dishes, emails I didn't answer, but none of it worked. Because the weight of that envelope wasn't in its physical form, but in the years of silence and secrets it represented. I knew, instinctively, that it had been hidden. I didn't need to ask how or why. The fact that my father had waited until my mother wasn't in the room to hand it to me said everything. When I finally peeled it open slowly, carefully, like I was dissecting something fragile, I found a single folded sheet of old stationery with handwriting I hadn't seen in almost 20 years, but which I recognized immediately as belonging to my grandfather. He'd been the only member of my family who ever made me feel like I wasn't too much, who had talked to me like I was an adult even when I was a child, who had asked real questions about my interests instead of brushing them off with glazed-over smiles and generic praise. He died during my second year of college, and I remembered the funeral only in pieces: the smell of lilies, the uncomfortable suit I wore, my mother crying into a tissue, but mostly concerned with making sure everyone signed the guest book. I didn't remember a letter. No one had mentioned a letter. But there it was. I unfolded it with both hands and began reading, and from the very first line, I felt something in my chest tighten, not out of sorrow, but recognition, that eerie comfort of hearing a voice you thought you had lost forever suddenly speak again through ink and time. "Emily, if you're reading this, it means you've grown into the woman I always believed you would become." That opening hit me harder than I expected, because it wasn't just a compliment, it was an acknowledgement. He had seen me, truly seen me, even back then, when I was the quiet one who spent more time building robots in the garage than going to school dances, when I would sit with him for hours talking about physics and he would actually listen. Not because he understood every detail, but because he cared enough to try. The letter went on to say that he had always admired my focus, my independence, and This part nearly undid me, my ability to live without needing to be applauded for everything I did. He told me he believed that kind of self-possession was rare, especially in a family where loudness passed for confidence and performance passed for connection. He told me not to let them chip away at that core of mine, not to bend myself into someone else's shape just to be easier to love. But it was the final paragraph that made my hands tremble. I left you something, he wrote, not because I want to burden you with sentiment or obligations, but because I believe in investing in people who will do something with what they're given. I asked your mother to pass it on to you when you turned 25. If she didn't, well, I trust that one day you'll find your way to it, because people like you always do. There was no mention of what he left me, no details about amounts or items, just that phrase, I left you something, and the unmistakable implication that my mother had never told me. I sat there, letters spread across my lap, eyes unfocused, heart pounding with a mixture of vindication and grief. Because of course she hadn't told me. Of course she'd kept it. She had made it abundantly clear, not just through words, but through every little choice over the years, that she saw my ambition as threatening, my success as alienating, and my emotional restraint as a flaw instead of the armor it had always needed to be. Still, there was a part of me that didn't want to believe she'd outright stolen something meant for me, not just an inheritance, but a piece of memory, a final gift from the one person who never made me feel less than. But that part of me had shrunk considerably in the past 48 hours. I did what I had to do. I contacted the executor of my grandfather's estate. It took a few phone calls, some archived records, and a long, strange conversation with a retired lawyer who sounded equal parts apologetic and confused, but I got my answer. There had been an account, a trust in my name, meant to be transferred upon my 20th birthday. And it had been. Just not to me. It had been absorbed quietly, redirected under the guise of family decisions, and signed off by someone who legally had the authority back then, but ethically had no right. The details didn't matter so much, the amount, the transactions, the excuses. What mattered was the confirmation. It was real. She'd done it. And she'd never said a word. I didn't confront her. Not right away. Maybe not ever. Because by then, I was already starting to understand something more important, something deeper than even the betrayal itself. I was never going to get what I wanted from her. Not an apology, not remorse, not even acknowledgement. And in a strange way, knowing that was the key to finally letting go of the fantasy that someday I would. Instead, I focused on the one thing that had always been mine, the one thing she could never touch, my future. I reopened the email from NASA. I reread the offer. I clicked accept. Not out of spite, not out of revenge, but because, for the first time, I wasn't doing it to prove anything to anyone. I was doing it because I wanted to, because I had earned it, because even if no one in my family ever clapped for me, I could clap for myself. A week later, I met Molly for coffee. She had texted, not to apologize, she never would, but with a vague message about clearing the air. I agreed, not because I owed her anything, but because I wanted to see her face one last time before everything changed. She looked tired. Pregnancy will do that, of course. But this was deeper, a kind of emotional fatigue that happens when your world stops revolving around you for a moment and you're forced to see people outside your own reflection. I'm not mad anymore, she said after we sat in silence for a while. But I do think you're just sad. Like, deep down. I nodded, sipping my coffee slowly, not because I agreed, but because I didn't need to correct her anymore. I said eventually. But not anymore. And I meant it. Because sadness is often just clarity that hasn't found its direction yet. That night, I packed my bags. I didn't tell anyone. Not my mother. Not even Molly. I booked my flight, reserved my apartment, and began planning the kind of life that didn't need to be celebrated by people who'd never taken the time to understand it. I stood in the doorway of my apartment, suitcase by my side, and for a moment I thought about all the things I'd leave behind, not just furniture or city blocks or routines, but expectations, disappointments, roles I never fit into, and conversations that had never been real. The last thing I did before leaving was slide the letter, the one from my grandfather, into a frame and hang it by the door. Not as a reminder of what I'd lost, but of what I'd always known, even before I had the courage to believe it. That being understood isn't the same as being loved. But sometimes, it's the start of something better.